The institution of the Ottoman Imperial Harem was not a singular entity, but a closed universe, a microcosm governed by a complex and unyielding hierarchy. It existed as both a physical space within the Topkapi Palace, a labyrinth of courtyards, apartments, and corridors, and as a legal and social construct, an apparatus of dynastic continuation and political strategy. Its primary function was the production of heirs, a biological imperative for a house that ruled a vast empire. Yet for the daughters born into this house, the Sultan's Kizlari, the imperial princesses, the harem's function was inverted. For them, it was not a cradle but a gilded antechamber, its primary purpose to prepare them for a single, defining transaction, the arranged marriage. The preparation of an Ottoman princess for marriage was a meticulous, years-long process, stripped of sentiment and reframed as statecraft. From childhood, her education was a curated syllabus of imperial necessity. She studied the Quran and classical poetry, not merely for piety or culture, but to embody the refined lineage of the Osmanoglu. She learned multiple languages, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, often Persian, sometimes Italian or Greek, as tools for potential diplomatic correspondence. She was instructed in music, calligraphy, and the intricate rules of court etiquette, all to become a living ornament, a testament to the dynasty's sophistication. Her value was not intrinsic but representational. She was a vessel for the imperial bloodline and a potential conduit for political alliance. The selection of a groom was a matter of the divan, the imperial council, and the sultan's sole prerogative. Candidates were not suitors, they were assets. They were almost exclusively high-ranking pashas, provincial governors, beylerbis, or military commanders, caputans. The calculus was cold and precise. Which general's loyalty needed cementing, which region's unrest could be quelled by binding its governor to the imperial family. Which rising star in the administrative or military hierarchy could be best controlled by making him a damad, a son-in-law of the Sultan. Romance, attraction, or personal compatibility were variables as irrelevant in this equation as the weather. The marriage was a geopolitical knot, tied not with a ribbon, but with the sinews of power. Once the candidate was selected, the machinery of the state shifted to enact the union. The announcement was a public spectacle, a grand firman imperial decree read aloud, proclaiming the Sultan's magnificent favor upon his servant. For the chosen man, it was the pinnacle of a career, a transformative elevation that placed him within the innermost orbit of power. He was granted a new title, Damadai Shariari, imperial son-in-law, vast estates, and a palace befitting his new station. Public celebrations, parades, feasts, distributions of alms, projected an image of joyous union and imperial benevolence to the populace of Constantinople. Yet, within the silent, secluded quarters of the harem where the princess resided, the atmosphere was of a different quality. The frenzy of preparation took on a somber, procedural tone. The most skilled tailors and jewelers of the empire were summoned not to consult with the bride on her preferences, but to outfit a dynastic emblem. Her wedding trousseau, the sais, was assembled. Hundreds of garments embroidered with gold thread, linens of the finest Egyptian cotton, bejeweled belts, and pearl-encrusted headdresses. Each item was logged in meticulous inventory registers, its value assessed, its existence noted as part of the princess's portable wealth, a wealth that remained, in essence, property of the imperial house. In the final days, a specific subset of the harem's senior women, the ustas and the princess's own Lala, tutor/governess, would begin a new form of instruction. This was not about etiquette or languages. It was a clinical, dispassionate briefing on the mechanics of the wedding night and the duties of a married woman of her rank. The language was circumspect, veiled in metaphor and religious obligation, but its purpose was unequivocal: to inform her of the physical transaction that was to occur, to frame it as her imperial and wifely duty, and to extinguish any expectation of personal agency or emotional connection. Her body was being prepared for state function. On the eve of the wedding, the princess would undergo the ritual bath, the hammam ceremony. Surrounded by senior women and female attendants, it was a purification ritual, but also a final inspection. Her hands and feet were dyed with henna in intricate patterns, a tradition symbolizing joy and protection, now rendered as a ceremonial stamp on state property. She would be dressed in the monumental wedding gown, a garment so heavy with brocade and gems it required assistance to move. Her face would be veiled. She was no longer an individual daughter. She was the embodiment of an imperial covenant, a diplomatic package ready for transfer. The public wedding ceremony, the nikah, was often a separate, male-centric affair where the groom and the sultan's representatives formalized the contract. The princess was absent. Her role came later, during the private conveyance to the damad's palace. She would be transported in a sealed, ornate carriage or palanquin, a procession of black eunuchs and guards ensuring her passage was seen by none. The journey was not one of anticipation, but of transit. She was leaving the only world she had ever known, the harem, not for freedom, but for another form of sequestration, under the authority of a man she likely had never seen, bound to him by a contract she did not draft, for purposes that had nothing to do with herself. The arrival at the groom's palace was not a welcome, but a delivery. She was received by his household staff, led to the designated marital chambers, rooms often prepared specifically for this night, rich with new furnishings gifted by the Sultan. Here she would wait. The weight of her garments, the scent of incense, the low light of oil lamps, all sensory details magnified in the silence. The outside world of celebration was a distant murmur. In this suspended moment, the full architecture of her life became apparent. Every lesson, every stitch of her gown, every whispered instruction had converged to this point. A silent, opulent room, and the impending arrival of a stranger to whom she had been consigned by the absolute will of the state. The transaction of her person was nearly complete. The mechanisms of control, however, were only beginning their work. The wedding night of an Ottoman princess was not a private moment, but a state-sanctioned procedure, monitored, documented, and stripped of intimacy. Its management was a direct extension of the harem's institutional control, now projecting its authority beyond the palace walls into the damad's own home. The chamber itself, while lavishly appointed, was a stage for a ritual of verification. The princess did not await her groom alone. In attendance, often stationed in an adjoining room or just outside the chamber door, was a delegation from the Imperial Harem. This group was led by a high-ranking black eunuch, a Kisler Agassi of significant stature, accompanied by one or more of the princess's trusted ustas or her lala. Their presence was not ceremonial, it was operational. They were the eyes, ears, and scribes of the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, and the Sultan himself. Their first duty was observation of the groom. His demeanor, his conduct, his treatment of the princess in this initial encounter were all subject to scrutiny. Any sign of disrespect, arrogance, or undue force would be noted and reported. The damad was powerful, but he was not above the dynasty he had married into. He was being tested. His performance in this chamber was a measure of his understanding of the delicate hierarchy. He was now royalty, but of a subordinate, derivative kind. He held authority over his wife, yet remained a servant of her father, the Padishah. The core of the institutional procedure, however, was the verification of consummation. This was the non-negotiable pivot upon which the entire political alliance turned. The marriage contract, the transfer of titles and wealth, the validity of the union, all were contingent upon its physical completion. To this end, the harem's representatives employed a system of documented proof. The most common and clinically symbolic was the inspection of the nuptial bedsheet. Following the couple's retirement, the attendants would wait. At the appointed time, or upon a signal, the eunuch and the senior female attendant would be admitted to the chamber. Their focus was a specific piece of linen. The presence of blood stains was the required physical evidence, the biological seal of the contract. This sheet was not discreetly discarded. It was formally collected, often by the female usta. In some documented cases, it was then presented to the damad for his visual confirmation before being taken into custody by the harem's delegation. This evidence was then transported back to Topkapi Palace under guard, treated not as a personal item, but as state documentation. It was presented to the Valide Sultan, the supreme authority of the harem. Her examination and acceptance of the proof were the final administrative steps in validating the marriage. The sheet itself was sometimes logged in harem records. Its existence served as an immutable receipt for the transaction that had been completed. The princess's most intimate experience was thus transformed into a bureaucratic datum, a file in the dynasty's archives. For the princess, the psychological architecture of this night was one of profound alienation. She was the central figure in a ceremony from which her personhood was erased. Surrounded by the opulent trappings of a celebration, she was subjected to a coldly efficient process of certification. The presence of her childhood attendants, figures who should have represented comfort, instead underscored her exposure. They were there as agents of the institution, their loyalty to the dynasty superseding any personal bond. She was simultaneously the subject of intense scrutiny and utterly alone. The groom, for his part, navigated a minefield of expectation. He was to perform his conjugal duty with the authority of a husband and the deference of a subject. He was to assert control without appearing domineering, to claim his right without violating the invisible but palpable sovereignty of the Osmanoglu bloodline that now flowed in his wife's veins. Failure to consummate the marriage would be a catastrophic political insult, potentially treasonous. Yet, any roughness, any lapse in the prescribed decorum could be interpreted as lese majesté. His future, his newfound status, hung on his ability to execute this deeply paradoxical performance under observation. The morning after did not bring respite, but a continuation of the ritual. The princess would be prepared by her attendants for the formal appearances. Her demeanor was now part of the public record. She was expected to exhibit a calm, dignified grace, the serene countenance of a fulfilled bride and a dutiful daughter of the Sultan. Any visible distress, tears, or agitation would be a breach of protocol, a stain on the carefully crafted narrative of joyous alliance. She had to embody the fiction that this orchestrated transaction was, in fact, a personal and familial happy event. Meanwhile, the wheels of the state turned with the confirmation. Messengers were dispatched. The Sultan was informed. The damad's new titles and land grants were now irrevocably activated. Announcements were made to the public, confirming the successful union. The political alliance was now formally cemented. The princess had served her primary dynastic function. Her value had been realized in the eyes of the state. Yet her transition was not into a partnership, but into a new form of isolated surveillance. She would now reside in her husband's palace, but her household staff was not fully his. Key positions, particularly senior maids, a treasurer, and often the head eunuch of her private quarters, were appointments made by and answerable to the Imperial Harem. They were her companions and her guardians, but also her wardens and informants. Her correspondence was monitored. Her expenditures from her personal allowance, the sizai, were recorded. Her social interactions, even with her husband's family, were filtered through this apparatus of control. The wedding night, therefore, was not an end, but an initiation. It initiated the princess into a lifelong state of being a monitored asset. It initiated the damad into the precarious inner circle of power. And it initiated the political bond between the Sultan and his servant, a bond sealed not by mutual trust, but by a documented act of biological and political compliance. The institution had not released its grip. It had simply extended its long, meticulous fingers into a new household, ensuring the princess, though physically transferred, remained a possession of the dynasty. The silence demanded of her was now permanent, enforced not just by walls, but by the omnipresent, quiet scrutiny of the system that had created her. The marriage of an Ottoman princess did not grant autonomy. It inaugurated a state of permanent political exile within the domestic sphere. Her new palace, while a symbol of her husband's elevated status, functioned as a satellite of the Imperial Harem, a distant province under the indirect rule of the Valide Sultan. The princess was its nominal mistress, yet its governance was shared. The staff loyal to the crown reported on household dynamics, expenditures, and most critically on the princess's health and conduct. Her primary duty, having validated the alliance, was now to produce heirs, specifically sons, who would carry the precious Shahzad prince bloodline into the next generation of the empire's elite. Her body remained a site of imperial interest, its cycles tracked, its pregnancies awaited as strategic events. The relationship with her husband, the damad, existed in a liminal space between intimacy and diplomacy. He was her lord, as custom and law decreed, but he was perpetually aware that she was the Sultan's daughter. Her person was inviolable in a way that transcended his marital rights. Any mistreatment risked not just personal disgrace but political annihilation. Consequently, many such marriages settled into a formal, distantly respectful coexistence. The princess maintained her own apartments and circle within his palace. The damad often took other wives or concubines for companionship and to sire children without the immense political weight that surrounded his imperial bride. The princess lived adjacent to a family, but was rarely at its emotional center. She was a revered icon, a living warrant of her husband's rank, often isolated by the very privilege she embodied. Her connection to her natal family, the imperial house, was maintained through strictly regulated channels. She could visit the harem, but such visits were rare, formal events requiring permission and elaborate preparation. More common was correspondence, Letters that passed through the hands of her eunuch steward and the palace's head scribe, their contents likely reviewed. The Valide Sultan and the Sultan's chief consorts sent gifts and directives, maintaining a thread of authority. This connection was a double-edged sword. It was her source of identity and protection, yet it was the very chain that bound her to her role. She could never fully be of her husband's house, for she was forever a daughter of the Osmanoglu. The ultimate measure of her success within this system was motherhood. Bearing a son was a geopolitical achievement. It forged a blood tie between the Sultan and his grandchild, further entwining the Damad's lineage with the dynasty. This child, a Shahzad by blood though not in the line of imperial succession, would be a significant figure, likely destined for high governorates or military command. For the princess, it provided a purpose and a measure of indirect influence. However, even this was managed. The education and career of her sons would be influenced by imperial policy. Her daughters would face the same fate she had, their marriages predetermined by the needs of the state a generation later. The cycle was self-perpetuating. The end of life for an Ottoman princess was often as quiet and controlled as its prime. Upon her death, the full machinery of the state engaged not in mourning, but in asset reclamation and legacy management. Imperial officials, alongside her husband's stewards, conducted a meticulous inventory of her sais and personal wealth. Every jewel, garment, and item of value was catalogued. A significant portion, often the most valuable, was legally required to revert to the imperial treasury. What remained for her children or husband was determined by complex Islamic inheritance laws and imperial decree. Her body, however, belonged to the dynasty in death as in life. She was not buried in her husband's family plot. She was interred in an imperial mausoleum, often near the tomb of a sultan or Valide sultan, her final resting place a permanent assertion of her true allegiance. Her funeral was a state ceremony, emphasizing her rank as the sultan's daughter over her role as a wife. The historical record they left is a study in deliberate silence. We possess inventories, treasury registers, and official decrees announcing their marriages. We have architectural records of the palaces they inhabited and the tombs where they lie. What we lack almost entirely is their voice. No personal diaries, no intimate letters penned in their own hand, no candid recollections survive. This absence is not an accident of time. It is the intended outcome of the system that raised them. Their literacy was curated, their correspondence monitored, their self-expression suppressed as a matter of state security and dynastic image. They were trained to embody an ideal, not to articulate an individual experience. The silence is their archive. Thus, the legacy of the Ottoman princess is not found in grand narratives of state, but in echoes and negative space. It is etched in the cold prose of a financial ledger listing returned wedding silks. It is implied in the architectural symmetry of a tomb lying beside a sultan's, a permanent daughter returned to the fold. It resonates in the repetitive pattern of marital alliances stretching across centuries, each one a faint carbon copy of the last. Their story is one of immense privilege wielded as an instrument of profound constraint. They lived at the apex of society, surrounded by luxury and deference, yet their lives were mapped with the precision of a military campaign, their most private moments rendered public record, their identities subsumed into the geopolitical calculus of an empire. There is no closure to this history, only a slow fade into the archival silence they were conditioned to maintain. We are left not with answers, but with the unsettling echo of the system itself, a system that could so meticulously care for the body, the lineage, and the symbol, while so completely erasing the person. The unspoken price of their royalty was the foreclosure of a self. The final control was not over their actions, but over their story. They were written into history as diplomatic instruments, and any whisper of the human cost has been successfully, institutionally muffled by the centuries.